Coming up on the Conservationists Assemble, well actually this episode is slightly different from our usual format focused on a particular species. Rather, we'll be discussing a crucial element of conservation and a particular part of any conservationist role that I hugely enjoyed when I was zookeeping, and a passion I very much continue to this day with the podcast, and that is conservation education. In this episode, we'll be talking about the importance of education within conservation and how creating a narrative in an exciting and perhaps interactive manner can foster a deeper engagement to and understanding of the issues facing the planet's threatened species and wild spaces. Welcome, fellow wildlife avengers, to the Conservationists Assemble. My name is Johnny Bloxham, your friendly neighbourhood animal advocate. I'm a former zookeeper with a passion for conservation education and the global efforts for threatened species and habitats around the world. I'm inviting you to join me as we take the fight to our planet's biggest villain and my arch nemesis, extinction. Whether you're new to animal advocacy or a veteran in wildlife preservation, this is the podcast for you. Each week, I'll be teaming up with Earth's mightiest wildlife heroes to unify the greatest collaboration of conservationists ever known, where we will be discussing our planet's epic species and what is being done to save them. This is the Conservationists Assemble podcast. Will you join the fight? Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Conservationists Assemble. How have you all been? While I might not have been able to publish an episode last week, that doesn't mean I wasn't thinking about the podcast or threatened species. I very much see an exciting future for the podcast, and I feel that 2025 and beyond is going to be very exciting. And I'm so thankful to have you all here with me. With that being said, let's get into the episode. Joining me now is Education Lead at Hertfordshire Zoo and a good friend, Chris Eley. Chris, welcome to the Conservationists Assemble. Thank you for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well, thanks, Johnny. Yeah, great to chat to you, and thanks for the opportunity for letting me come on and talk all things conservation education. Really appreciate the opportunity.
It's my absolute pleasure. It's something that I think both of us agree on. It's quite an exciting part of ex situ organisations nowadays. Obviously, there's many focal roles and duties of these organisations. But conservation education seems to know no bounds with the way that the world's developing, and quite an exciting one. So first and foremost, what is conservation education?
So conservation education, I mean, it comes in a number of different forms for me. So obviously I'm Head of Conservation Education and Engagement at Hertfordshire Zoo, which is my day-to-day role. And within that, it's initially, I think it's really important to make connections with wildlife. That's really important. I think it's really important that we are creating those initial connections. And I think, zoos ultimately don't exist without education and the ability to do that. When I was a child, I spent a lot of time actually going down to Paynton Zoo, and my grandparents there were visitor engagement kind of volunteers on touch tables. And then I see myself all the way down the line after a big career change being in zoos myself and working in conservation. I think it's really important because, at Hertfordshire Zoo, we have such a huge reach and we're growing massively, and therefore we're bringing in all new audiences, and we've got the ability to educate people about conservation all the way through from early years up to our Wise and Wild programme, which looks at going into care homes. We are launching a new programme with University of the Third Age. So we try to make sure that conservation education in its truest form basically touches all those different age groups and connects people with wildlife, the threats, but also sprinkle conservation optimism over all of that, because I think there's been a lot of studies that have shown about eco-anxiety and the rise of eco-anxiety across the UK and across the world. So, we have almost a duty to, yes, highlight some of the issues that are going on with wildlife out in the wild, but also some of the incredible organisations on the ground that are doing that vital work to safeguard the future of these animals and ecosystems as well. And alongside all of that, it's also empowering our visitors to be able to make sustainable behaviour changes, that's very, very critical and a major part of what we do. And whether that is making sure that someone's making right decisions around kind of purchasing products using sustainable palm oil or FSC wood, or considering the choices they're making on a weekly shop when it comes to seafood and MSC fish. All of those things are incredibly important. So I think we have, in conservation education, I think there's the connection with wildlife is very, very important. The deeper level understanding of the threats wildlife face across the world and on your doorstep. The organisations and individuals that are out there doing that great work to protect wildlife and safeguard their futures, and then creating these opportunities for visitors, school groups, whoever it may be, through formal, informal education opportunities, to really drive home the fact that they can have an impact as well. So, in short, it encompasses all of that. I think I've kind of rambled around that answer a little bit there, Johnny, but it does it's multifaceted, you know.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, and it isn't just a kind of black and white thing. There's this like say multifaceted web
Yeah.
of elements, and yeah, like I certainly had it in my notes that kind of raising awareness, that connection to nature, certainly so much here in the UK, where we think that we're this nature depleted country, and to an extent we are, but actually, through capacity building with those sustainable actions, we're able to provide people with the answers, so to speak, of what they can do for nature, and in return what nature then can do for us. But you mentioned eco-anxiety, and certainly when we think about the cost of living crisis, and encouraging people to make those sustainable choices, how can we best present those actions to such a people such that they start making those changes?
I think it's a really interesting one, and I think a lot of that comes with that initial connection. So let's take a species in isolation. Let's look at the African penguin, right? It's been very well documented over the last couple of months. They've gone from endangered to critically endangered on the IUCN Red List. There are some real challenges for African penguins, and when you look at that as a situation as a whole, actually, whether it be overfishing, whether it be the issues with climate change, that human wildlife coexistence, all of those aspects are having a significant impact on African penguins. And I think it's, if you can story tell that well to the public, they start to understand the importance of these critically endangered birds or on the planet, and the fact we might not see them. I think BirdLife International was saying something around 2035 is going to be the year that we might not see a wild African penguin, which is shocking. And there's a part where we can connect with organisations like Sandcob, who we work with at Hertfordshire Zoo as our long-term conservation partner. But I think if you story tell well enough, that is fundamentally very, very important. And I know through the podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the other things that I do behind the camera, that is all about narratives and storytelling. But actually, storytelling is so powerful, and we do that a lot with definitely with formal education and school groups that come through the doors at Hertfordshire Zoo. Is you've got to get people invested in that whole narrative, and that comes from looking at all the interesting adaptations and behaviours that those animals have, creating those connections, then talking about those threats, then talking about the organisations that are out there saving those birds, and then they feel empowered. That empowerment should come from the end of that narrative, right? That people are willing to kind of make that change. The cost of living crisis is hugely impactful, though, just from a conservation education point of view. When we just look at, say, like school groups as an example, we pride ourselves on being extremely accessible and inclusive for individuals to really connect with wildlife. But alongside of that, schools coming in to learn all of this stuff and explore those narratives. The cost of living crisis is having a massive impact on connections with conservation, because schools now, they can afford tickets to come into Hertfordshire Zoo, but post-COVID can't afford coaches to get into zoos. So how do we, in this world where costs are tighter, have that impact and create those narratives? And actually, some of that is through high quality outreach programs as well, which is a really fundamental facet of conservation education. So making sure that all of those aspects are really really tailored to kind of formal education delivery and schools, and hopefully you can target as many students as possible and give them that experience and make those connections. But it is hard during this time. It's a challenge for everybody. It's a challenge for everybody to go to a zoo. People aren't going to be able to afford to go on safari. Like those opportunities are limited to a lucky few, and therefore, you have to think creatively about how you can make it accessible. We're very fortunate because obviously we have the CBBC TV series One Zoo 3 hosted at Hertfordshire Zoo and our sister site called the Big Cat Sanctuary. And Ty, Aaron, and Cam Whitnell, who are the stars of that show, are very good at creating those connections with wildlife through that TV program, and that's something that's accessible through iPlayer, right? So, things like that, thinking creatively about how we do those things, are incredibly important.
So then when we talk about conservation education in a practical setting, zoos are perfectly positioned to tell those stories, like you say. But when there's a variety of age ranges and demographics coming through the doors, and say, you're doing an African penguin talk, for example, and you've got that range of ages, how important is language, and how can we tailor language to deliver that keeper talk as effectively as possible so that you're providing something for all of those age groups, keeping everyone engaged, but also fulfilling the education ethos of a zoo?
Yeah, exactly. I actually think the best way to articulate this is talk about zoo interpretation. So we try to tailor all of our zoo interpretation now in a house style that is designed to be the reading age of a 10-year-old. That's almost a perfect pinch point to be able to convey to adults, but then convey to younger children as well. We have lots of cooperative learning opportunities around the zoo for our interp signage. We really tried to, when we created and developed the new Sun Bear Heights habitat. I say new, it's been open for a couple of years now. But some of the signage there, we created this huge kind of finger maze activity where young people would run their finger through the maze from the sun bear past the threats to the food that sun bears love, right? There you're articulating a number of things. The threats that they're trying to avoid, and then you're talking about kind of diet of those animals, wild diet of those animals, So those things are really important. But alongside that, we put some quite hard-hitting conservation education messaging around Dr. Wong, who runs the Borneo and Sun Bear Conservation Centre, and his incredible work to safeguard sun bears. And the thought around how you set out, so it's thinking about these things almost in isolation. And the one thing that we're thinking about is actually, if we can get young people to really engage in that play aspect, if their parents are standing there and they're either helping them through cooperative learning and guiding them through that play aspect, but then also alongside that, if they're not, and the child is just doing a self-led on that activity, then the adult is able to essentially learn that higher level content around, and then even articulate it back to their children in a language form that works. I think that's what we try to do quite a lot of with our informal activities as well, is we make sure that, there's elements in there that appeal to adults as well. So I really love when we get, when we run activities and it's almost, there's that collaborative and cooperative kind of learning going on between parents and their children. That really inspires me, because that shows that, both of them are learning. And that is an incredibly powerful thing to see if you can set something up like that. and like things like in education sessions, we use a lot of things like we try to tailor things for people to make infer things about what they're seeing. So inferences are really important. We do this amazing task about snow leopards where we basically have these mail bags from Nepal, and within them they've got all these amazing photos of snow leopards, but you can hardly see the snow leopard because they're amazing camouflage. Now, the students think they're just trying to spot the snow leopard, and that's great, right? But they're also making, after that, through powerful questioning, and making inferences about what the life of a snow leopard is like, because in those scenes, you can see their habitat. You might even see their prey species. You're going to see actually whether it's a mother and two cubs, and you're going to learn a bit more about their behaviors. So I think there's multiple different ways, and it's all about layering is really important as well. Um, so yeah, those kind of approaches go really a long way for us, and I think if it's a good way to make sure we're hitting a number of different age ranges there when it comes to some of that conservation education content.
And in terms then, because we've talked about a number of species where things are working well, such as the African penguins or the sun bears, or just things that are happening at the zoo. How about maybe the species that aren't flagship species where you're trying to get people invested in invertebrates or creepy crawlies or just things that aren't necessarily deemed cute and fluffy? How do we go about maybe empowering and storytelling for those species that don't necessarily get the attention that they so rightly need and deserve?
That is a great question, and that's something that I deal with kind of outside my main role as head of conservation education and engagement at the Hertfordshire Zoo. So it's probably good for the listeners to know that I was the Bird Photographer of the Year Conservation Award winner in 2024. And this is where those species that don't get as much attention really come to the fore. So I have a huge passion for vultures. I don't know where it came from, but I am incredibly passionate about the conservation of vultures. I've worked for a number of years going out and volunteering each year out at Volpro in South Africa. And I started to use my skills behind the camera to document some of the stuff that was going on with Volpro and some of the amazing work that's going on out there to safeguard the future of vultures. In particular, the Cape vulture and the critically endangered African whiteback vulture as well. They are big focal points for Volpro's mission. Now, this is where you have to really kind of lean into the fact that actually you need to turn people's perceptions of vultures, right? Vultures historically have always had kind of been much maligned, much misunderstood. The media has positioned them in certain ways that make us have a sense and a feeling about those birds. If you work with them for extended periods of time, you understand that they are amazing birds. They're adorable, but enigmatic. They're amazing, amazing creatures, right? So that's where I really need to think about those kind of narratives and talking a lot about kind of vultures right now. That is what I try to do. I try to spin a narrative that actually what I want to do is I want to create empathy for the vultures because they're actually super fragile birds, but also super resilient, right? And through my photography, what I documented when I won the award was a 6-image portfolio, and it looked at power lines and the impact on Cape vulture populations in that area of South Africa. And you've really got to showcase the vulnerability, change the narrative. Let's switch up the narrative, let's flip it on its head, and let's talk about vultures and the fact that, yes, obviously they feed from carcasses. As my grandmother says to me, and this is I'm going to refer to my grandmother here. So my nan, who's 95 years old, who continually said when I went out to Volpro, "Oh, I don't like vultures. I don't like vultures." And then when I won the award, I showed all the images to her, and she kind of went 180 on the whole thing, and now she loves vultures at 95 years old. Look, hey, if we can educate 95-year-olds and change their opinion on vultures, that's great. But yeah, you've got to. I think with vultures, you've got to just change that narrative and show actually, they're really interesting birds. The challenges for them are infinite in some ways. Just take the hooded vulture, least concern 10 years ago, critically endangered now, 5 years left, maybe they're saying, which is a stark reality. But also within all of that narrative, you've got to really spin about the kind of what I like to say. So you've got to create that empathy. You've got to show the issues that are going on. And I saw some stuff when I was out of Volpro. I actually witnessed a Cape Vulture hit a power line, and then with the dedicated team out there had to put the fire out that it created, but the vulture passed away. Really, really stark scene. And I've been on a 4-hour journey and then 4 hours back to find a GPS tracker from a bird that had been released that we fully believe was poached. That because we just found this GPS tracker hung off the smallest branch of a tree, it would not have fallen like that. So the assumption was that bird was poached. And you're standing there and you're looking at all these situations and you're thinking to yourself, we've got to respin the narrative on these birds, but you've also got to back those people that are out there in the field on the front line, because they are so important, right? The human endeavour that goes into some of these conservation projects, and the individuals, and I'll personally now shout out Kerry at Volpro, who's CEO at Volpro. She is an absolute conservation legend, an amazing person, and someone I'm very proud to have kind of been able to work alongside when I go out for those few weeks. And she's an incredible human being. But it's taken that one incredible human being to really bring vultures to the fore. And all I'm trying to do with that and my camera is try and narrate that story the best it can be. So vultures, definitely. And then also you've got to sprinkle that conservation optimism on there, right? You've got to give hope, right? So there was examples out in, Volpro have moved part of their operation down to Shamwari in the Eastern Cape. And, they're seeing wild vultures coming down to the feeding sites down there in the rehab open aviaries. They're coming down and feeding off those carcasses, and actually feeding off the carcasses now of dead animals that are being found across the reserve for the first time in many years. These are conservation success stories that need to be highlighted. So, but it's getting buy-in, right? Because buy-in is so important for, especially in a zoo world, right? We're very, very conscious of animals that get good following on, let's talk about capybaras, right? Pop culture dictates that meerkats were popular, now it's capybaras, right? So any of that content, is going to go through the roof, right? And all of that stuff is super important for creating those connections. Actually, a skill and art is being able to do that for species that are unknown or underappreciated, right? And I think a lot, actually, when you see a lot now, obviously, pangolins, we've gone from being 1990s giant pandas, figureheads for conservation. Probably the majority of the population of the world had no idea what a pangolin was.
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest that is starkly different now, because they've almost taken on that mantle as, along with probably rhinos, maybe as as those species that are at the forefront of people's minds when you think about conservation. But yeah, it almost sometimes feels insurmountable, the challenges that wildlife has just generally. But you also need these individuals, and you need people to just back a species.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just go all in. Just go all in on vultures. Go all in on helmeted hornbills. I think about some of the organisations that I've been lucky to go and see their work. Go in on Visayan pteryctic hornbills as an example. It's through the Talarak Foundation that I've kind of been out and seen some of their work. You've got to have these individuals who are willing to go all in and put all their chips and all their stake on those animals. And that's why I think when people turn around to me and go, I don't really like vultures, that does frustrate me, because actually, yeah, they're pretty amazing birds, But hopefully that kind of brings in some other elements there, I guess, Johnny, as well, of some of the other stuff that I do. but definitely the narration of what goes on in vulture conservation is really important. Really important to me. Yeah.
Yeah, and it definitely does show, and it obviously goes hand in hand because you can use elements from what you're seeing and achieving in the zoo. I'm sure in elements of your
Yeah.
work with Volpro and vice versa kind of thing. That kind of marriage of in situ and ex situ. Obviously, we know that it's not an us and them thing, and that they both working together are going to be the ultimate difference maker. And then that third crucial aspect is the visitors. If you could like sit down with visitors and just be like, this is what I would like from you when you were to visit a zoo, what would that be? Just so that it not makes your job easier, but just to give education and the best opportunity it can get.
I think that's a really good question because actually it, it varies so much visitor to visitor, right? I think you need to differentiate the outcomes for different people because there'll be some people who come to a zoo and have quite an in-depth knowledge of all species or specific species. They might be people that are coming from other zoos, aquariums, part of that network. There may be people who are just really interested in that area, working conservation in that area, etc. You know, the outcomes that they need from your zoo are probably vastly different to your average visitor who, one of the most powerful bits of insert we put up around the zoo is a simple, what's the difference between a leopard and a jaguar, right? Like, and just point out the differences between them. And, sometimes that's really important because it could be their first trip to the zoo. It could be, the learning outcomes and what the expected learning outcomes are um, from different visitors, first time visitors, people who haven't really engaged with wildlife, are going to be vastly different, right? In education, obviously, I've got a background in formal teaching in schools. We look at the most, the some, and the few, right? Like, and you have differentiated learning outcomes for those groups in your lessons, knowing that some will exceed the expected outcome and want to learn deeper and further. And then you'll also have some that might not meet that, but will still have to come away with something from that experience. So I think in answer to your question, I guess the best thing is that you are able to sit down with that person because then you can talk to them about their prior knowledge, prior understanding, and also what they want to achieve from it. But yeah, like I think it's very much on a person to person, case to case basis about what I would like them to learn as they come around the zoo. Of course, I'd love everyone to come out, like Johnny Five, I think it was, wasn't it? The robot who could just take in all that
Yeah.
information. I'd just be like, yes, read every sign, read every single thing, go to every keeper talk, and leave feeling completely empowered to save wildlife. We know that's not the case, and we know, especially like Hertfordshire Zoo, very tailored to young families. It's a good fun day out. There's other aspects across the zoo as well. What we need to do is capture those people that might come for the dinosaurs or the soft play or all those different other elements, and actually go, well, hang on, we are here and we are a purposeful organisation that is trying to do the best job we can to educate about wildlife and contribute to conservation as well.
So off the back of that, then, how do zoos assess the effectiveness of their education programs, and what methods are in place to ensure the continued success and advances in the education methods used?
Yeah, so we have a full and comprehensive evaluation program based on or strategy, sorry, based on our conservation education strategy. So we have a central document that is aligned to WASA and their conservation education strategy, but also EASA and BIASA's conservation education standards. And good evaluation depends, again, it's all differentiated, right? So we have a session called Fur, Feathers and Scales. You can imagine this is a reception year one based session, and it really looks at the differences between mammals, fish, reptiles, amphibians, and birds. Really, really simple. There's loads of studies out there that suggest that if you are having fun, that you are going to be learning more. So within that session, it's a simple coin drop box at the end. So we can understand, actually, did you have fun in today's session? Well, if you did, the chances are that you're going to learn stuff. As you go further up the age ranges, you can make those evaluation processes slightly more detailed. So for our remarkable rainforest session, which is a slightly older audience in formal education sessions, we actually send out reflective postcards that the students then write their reflections on, and then they put them in a stamped addressed envelope, send it back to us at the zoo, and basically we can look at some of their responses. So we look at their responses and evaluate it based on their responses. And then when we go right up to the top end, when we're working on some of our post-16 and FE delivery, we have almost, so we've worked with Unifrog, which is the largest careers and destinations platform in the UK. The reach is absolutely huge, and we've been on the top 5% of content on there. But we created a course called The Role of Zoos in Conservation. And it's a really, really powerful 7-unit course that students can do, adds into their profile. But fundamentally, at the end of that, at the start, we asked them, on a scale of 1 to 5, what do you think is our zoo's roles in conservation? And often it's very mixed across the board. But by the end of that course, we've reframed that and taught them about the role of zoos in conservation. And therefore it's 4s and 5s, and largely 5s at the end, which is very impactful, right? The relationship between the two. So we're evaluating also that change in opinion as well. So hopefully those young people are going to come and visit more zoos, engage in all of that kind of stuff. And then you can do kind of evaluation around dwell time, around interpretation, around habitats. Our new native species area at the zoo, 9 sand lizards in there, probably got the best dwell time because people are searching for them and they're interested, and the chances are they're going to stand there and read more of the interp because they're spending more time there. The longer you can hold people in a set location, and the learning can extend, right? We talk a lot about increasing that dwell time, creating those habitats where people want to stick around and learn more, not just feel like people are going on almost like a shopping trip and ticking off animals like you would on a shopping list. Oh, there's a okapi, there's a tapir, those kind of things. I guess sometimes people just see the animal, they're happy they've seen the animal, they take a photo on their phone and they move on, right? But we've got to try and keep them there, because if you keep them there, they're going to learn more about those species. So all of those aspects are embedded in our evaluation, so we can really start to know, and it's on a very basic level, but that how they've connected. And we have quite a young audience at the zoo, so actually our kind of education sessions are fairly short, sharp, punchy sessions, right? When we do some of our more detailed program for post-16 and FE, we have a greater chance to get more data out of that,
And you mentioned that the network of kind of BRs or ERs or WARs or conservation strategies, and aligned with the role of zoos in conservation program. Yeah. So what is the benefit of having that network of people coming together and discussing their experiences with education, and kind of what does that do for education as a whole?
Well, I think I think everyone has a role and responsibility to be able to drive forward the quality of what we're doing across that network. I don't think you can stand idly by and just imagine that you're doing a good job. You need to reflect on that. You need to see what other people are doing. That needs to basically drive standards forward. We're not as big as Chester. We're not as big as ZSL, but we punch way above our weight in conservation education. And that's because we've got a great team, and hopefully hopefully good leadership of our team. But look, we push hard and we're always thinking, we're always adapting, we're always changing, we're flexible, we're adaptable, we're always looking at outside influences, like not just in the zoo world, like we need to, the zoos and aquariums need to be open to learning from everyone when it comes to education. Museums are really, really important. Just those learning opportunities in museums, they don't have the luxury of a sun bear walking past. They have to create those learning opportunities. So I think it's being open to learn. And actually, I've learned at some of those conferences, I've learned some amazing things from zoos that are smaller than we are and that have a smaller team. And we still have quite a small team, but you need to. It's also about checking that ego a little bit. Check that ego at the door. Go in with an open mind. That's good. But also, all of the stuff that we do should really drive everyone else forward, right? And I would like to think that we get driven on by zoos that are smaller than us, and we take inspiration also from zoos that are bigger than us. But I'd like to think, the Chesters and the ZSLs and the RZSs of this world are looking over their shoulder going, oh, look what Hertfordshire Zoo are doing, and actually this is really great, and are we pushing at this in that kind of way as well? So, of which of course they are, but you can also have an impact without even working in those organisations, right? Collaboratively and collectively, it can just be driven forward, and I think that's the power of some of those. Some of those conferences, and we're actually hosting the BIASA Conservation Education Conference at Hertfordshire Zoo in November. And for me, it's about like those conferences have to be full of practical takeaways, which are differentiated for different collection sizes. So we need to push, and we need to give people opportunities to learn. Like at the zoo, and this is with my old kind of teacher head on in past life, but I was assistant head teacher director of sixth form in a secondary school. I was responsible for quality assurance of teaching across the school, so teaching and learning across that school. And let's be frank, like when it comes to it, zoos are, should think about how they're educating in that way. Pedagogical theory, they should be thinking about teaching and learning strategies. I'm not sure everyone is. We definitely are. We have a focus on questioning, the power of questioning, how a good question actually can really enhance learning. I'll give you one example, which is really, really important, right? Okay. So essentially, I imagine most educators, when they ask a question, will wait for someone to raise their hand and ask them directly what the answer to that question is. Okay. Well, I need to assess the understanding of every single student in that classroom, right? So fundamentally, if I just point to that student, I'm getting an answer from one student. I don't know whether that's a high achiever. I don't know their prior attainment. I don't have access to that information, right? They might be a real high achiever. They might not be. You don't know what their prior knowledge is. But actually, if you went, right, you've all got 20 seconds, this is the question, this is the key question, you're going to talk to the person next to you, and then you circulate that room and facilitate conversations between pairs of students in that classroom. You are then picking up from every single child or a wider selection of students what they've learned and what their understanding is and what they've learned. So you can move that lesson on quicker or slower, dependent on what they've learned. And that's just one aspect that we focus on in teaching and learning. And me and my team are really thinking about how we embed better questioning into our education sessions to maximize learning outcomes. If we're only seeing students for half an hour in a session, how can we maximize learning outcomes? And good questioning is part of that. But there's lots of other methods, but that's how we do it. So you can see where I'm coming from, right?
Yeah.
And I think for me, long gone are the days, and one thing we really understand is what children's needs are now, and they're very switched on. They understand, like, actually, if you come in with, some arts and crafts bits and pieces, and like some like homemade looking laminate sheets and all of that kind of stuff, there's no point of difference to what they're getting in a school, right? Okay. We look very closely at like the high quality multimedia, so the video content that our marketing team get, like that is a real point of difference for us, because they can really see that through those education sessions. We think about really innovative resources and activities that they can undertake. All of those things are really important. You have to be a point of difference as well, and if to get more and more. So, for context, at Hertfordshire Zoo, 92% of schools that had an education talk with us, so a formal education talk with us in 2023, they came back and booked an education talk in 2024. So, like 92% retention rate highlights to me that we are doing a particularly good job at delivering. Teachers are happy with what we're delivering. It's key stage appropriate, and all of that is really important, right? Like, for conservation education to be successful, we're not just, and this is where this loops back around to that collaboration part. We don't want schools to go away thinking, oh, I'm never going to go to a zoo again because the education offering wasn't great. If we can all drive each other, if we can all drive the standards up across all zoos and improve conservation education so it feels like a premium, I hate saying this, but like a premium product, a premium visit, something that where there's really good learning, it's a safe environment for those students, and they can really enjoy themselves and have fun. That is super, super important, because what you don't want to do is be a zoo that is turning schools off coming to zoos because you're not delivering what you should be delivering in regards to quality. That has an impact across potentially the board. And I don't think you maybe in the zoo world don't always think about it like in that way sometimes, but everyone has a responsibility to educate in the best way possible.
And so then, in terms of everyone having the opportunity or the, the need to deliver education at the highest standard, it's not a question that the people that work within zoos, the keeper teams, the education officers, the directors, everyone is passionate about what they do and have the welfare, the future of the species, the education at the forefront of what they do. But maybe not everyone has the confidence to deliver education. Maybe their public speaking isn't what their strongest attribute is. So how can we best support the staff so that we can best support the education message that we're putting out?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one, actually. I've seen some of the most powerful learning experiences in a zoo setting actually happen from individual conversations with keepers where it's something really specific. Like a lot of keepers are animal people, right? They're not necessarily people. I think at Hertfordshire Zoo it's slightly different because education is so embedded in the fabric, and actually we're quite a small site in some regards. So if a keeper comes out of a keeper door, they're right in a busy thoroughfare of visitors. So being customer facing, I think, really does help. But actually, some of the most powerful learning experiences in zoos happen when no one else is listening, and it's a one-to-one conversation that you're asking a keeper as they're going around about something specific you're seeing right there. So it might be, a jaguar interacting with some enrichment, and then that keeper has that conversation with that person. Actually, that one-to-one time is something that they'll remember, and it will be memorable. And actually making something memorable actually means that knowledge retention is probably more likely to stick in there. And knowledge retention is really, really important. There's a learning retention pyramid that we talk a lot about, that people will learn by in different ways. They'll retain that information by learning in different ways. So if it's simply listening to something, they're probably going to retain 5% of that. But actually, if it's doing something, they're going to retain 70-80% of doing that. If it's teaching someone else, high chance it's like 100%, right? So we need to think about it in that way. And actually, those memorable experiences are really important. So even those keepers that maybe lack the confidence to, as I will do, is be my bombastic self in front of a group of anyone who will listen. Uh, I think individually, those actually some of the most powerful conversations I've had have been one-to-one conversations where I've probably chewed someone's ear off about vultures, even though we don't have vultures at Hertfordshire Zoo. I've somehow managed to curveball it round. But those things are really powerful, right? Like like you can't underestimate and downplay how important a one-to-one conversation with a visitor is. And it could be that someone is absolutely obsessed with reptiles or amphibians or inverts. And you know how we were talking earlier about kind of changing perception on
Hmm.
not necessarily some of those flagship species you're talking about. I think it's, actually if you're a really engaging kind of LVI keeper and you're at Hertfordshire Zoo and you're responsible for uh, those animals, if you find a visitor who might have an interest in that, crikey, you can really spark a flame somewhere in that person even further. Sometimes it's not always about those big set piece keeper talks. Sometimes it's more about, you know, the other elements
Hmm.
and that day to day connections and I think as well, like I really reflected a lot after I was 11 years in formal teaching, and I thought, well, anyone remember me for my teaching? And there's set moments, but really powerful moments that I reflect back on in different settings and with different students, where I think actually it sounds a bit corny, like those teacher recruitment videos where it's like get into teaching. And you think, and sometimes actually those things do happen, and like maybe because of the stress and pressure of school based education here in the UK, maybe a lot less than you would think because of the other pressures, or maybe just sometimes you don't have because you're so busy the time to reflect on that. And I think sometimes maybe zookeepers they're so busy looking after their animals, actually, do they have the time to reflect on that individual conversation that they've had with someone and go, wow, actually, I really changed the narrative of that species. I really gave them something to think about, or really put a question in their mind to really think about what they're doing in their day to day lives that they can improve. I really connected to conservation, and wow, yeah, that for me is really important. And I think maybe sometimes uh, it's standing back, and I'm always looking at those. I'm very like hyper aware of those situations. So if I've had a really good conversation with someone, I'll be like, I'll walk away, and for the next 2 minutes, I'm like, wow, they learned this, and I wish I told them this because then they would have taken that on board. Maybe when you're working on the animal side of stuff, you're not so hyper aware of that stuff.
Hmm.
I actually think it's really important for people to reflect on that because actually, as zookeepers at Hertfordshire Zoo are important, such an important component of how we convey conservation education across to our audience, and they are the gatekeepers in a lot of ways to what people are learning. So you know that's super important.
Yeah, I guess it's a very appropriate message to any zoo goers who might be
Yeah,
listening. Utilize the zookeepers as much as you possibly can, and some zookeepers might absolutely hate me for saying this because they have packed schedules. They are nutritionists, they're caretakers, but
yeah.
utilize the zookeepers and the workers who are so connected to those species because they are truly incredible people.
Yeah, 100%. And I think sometimes they don't realize how powerful they are in regards to conveying those messages. And I've stood back and seen conversations between zookeepers and members of public and thought, wow, that's a really powerful conversation. And I felt drawn into that just by listening. Like so. And I think there's we as an education team, just for context, the rest of Hertfordshire Zoo staff wear purple t-shirts.
Hmm.
We on education wear green, the same as the zookeepers, because we actually believe that young people really want to hear from the people that look after the animals and are part of that zoo team, or at least that wider conservation team as well. So, like I often will talk about some of the experiences that I've encountered across the world in conservation with different species, and actually they love that. They love people who are involved with the animals. That's not to devalue anyone else's role across
Mm, definitely not.
Hertfordshire Zoo, but when it comes to education, those those young people, they really do connect to the green t-shirts. Yeah.
I love that, and I think we've certainly, cemented, and I'm sure probably people are aware of how important conservation education and how much of a role it is within a modern zoo's duties. But yeah, I think we've probably really touched on and cemented that in people's minds when they are now visiting the zoos in the future. So before we move on to look at what you get up to outside of Hertfordshire Zoo, are there any just last points about conservation education that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think it's. I think what we've touched upon, and I think these are the key kind of takeaways from my perspective, are that collaboration is so important to drive standards forward across all zoos, and everyone needs to be pulling their weight to have high quality conservation education. I think we can't. And the other point is that we can't downplay how important the role of a conservation educator is in making those initial connections, talking about the challenges for wildlife, and then also sprinkling in that conservation optimism around some of our conservation partners and individuals and organisations, and then creating that sustainable behaviour change. And I think as well, it's really important because, you know, conservation education is incredibly important. A lot of zoos are, commercially driven, but actually, if you have a really good conservation education program, it can be not only profitable for those zoos, and people can justify their own existence within those organisations, which I think is sometimes what uh, conservation educators have to like almost justify their roles,
Hmm.
because it doesn't directly maybe impact huge amounts of income and all of that kind of stuff. But for us, it certainly does, because the quality of the teaching, the quality of the delivery that we do has brought in more numbers, and that generates more income. That gives me more staff to drive more drive more sessions, and more, that has more impact. So yeah, that's really important. So those kind of things are kind of key reflections for me about the future and importance of conservation education. And I think as we move further down the line, and maybe we start to lose some of these species that we've maybe talked about, which would be absolutely horrific, at some point there is going to be a real have to be a change, and that is going to be led by a lot of conservation educators that exist across in all organisations across the world that are trying to protect wildlife.
Yeah, real food for thought there. So yeah, I think that's a really great point to finish up the segment on conservation education, and now we're going to look at how you got to where you are, what you do outside of work, and you've alluded to it, throughout that your background is formal teaching. So you just walk us through your career journey from that early inspiration of seeing grandma and granddad at the touch tables
Yeah,
through to where you are now.
yeah, sure, yeah. So career journey wise, it's actually really interesting, kind of journey, and I guess for me. So yeah, look, as a kid, would always go to painting zoo. My grandparents were kind of volunteers there. Education volunteers would run like kind of the touch tables at what was the old Golden Lion Tamarind House, I think, opposite where they've got the big baboon rock. Yeah, yeah. So very many lots of childhood memories. But there's one thing I have to make an admission of. When I was a child, actually, I love learning about animals, reading books. But actually, I was attacked by a dog when I was a child, and I had a real fear up until about kind of like 12 years old, 13 years old, of animals. I like love learning about them, love going to zoos, but actually anything free roaming, I was a bit like, but obviously quickly grew out of that, and I have four rescue dogs now, so that hasn't really impacted me at all. Um, so yeah, so then I went on, and I actually trained to be a PE teacher initially. I played a lot of sports, so hockey was a big sport for me, and kind of what I played a lot of university and club hockey as well, and was a PE teacher. But like with many PE teachers, you have a really good rapport with a lot of pupils that maybe have some slightly challenging behaviour but might be good at sport. And soon moved into kind of more of a pastoral role. Worked in 3 different schools over an 11-year period, and I led the sixth form that I managed at my final school to Ofsted Outstanding, which, for anyone who knows about education or has read anything in the press, probably doesn't mean a hell of a lot now. Not that I'm dissing Ofsted, but yeah, I am. And then basically, I kind of got to a point where I was like, I wanted to experience something else in education. And I thought, actually, this is a nice opportunity. Maybe 11 years, leaving a bit of legacy at the school of the Ofsted Outstanding for the sixth form. So I decided actually to take a role with the Peter Jones Foundation. So I actually became senior program lead at the Peter Jones Foundation. So Peter Jones, as in Peter Jones from Dragon's Den. So I was running education programs for 2.5 years across the country, national enterprise and entrepreneurship programs. So giving funding to students from disadvantaged backgrounds to start their own business and give them access to like amazing entrepreneurs from across the UK and the world, basically to teach them and help them how to become better entrepreneurs. And that had big set piece events where students pitch to Peter Jones for £5,000 worth of investment. This is also the point where I say I'd love to be a reptile person, because then I could go from I work with Komodo dragons, because I could go from one dragon to another. Like that would be my that would be my fake autobiography title. And I did 2.5 very happy years there, but a lot of that was through COVID. I really realised that I'm not someone that's going to be stuck behind a computer screen all the time and remotely. And actually, just a few things aligned for myself and my wife that meant that I actually had the flexibility to go and start. And initially, I was like, I really want to be a bird keeper. That's what I want to do. And I love birds, and I have spent time on the bird section at Hertfordshire Zoo working as a keeper. But fundamentally, the educator in me does not die. And actually, I've seen that I can have a huge impact with the educational experience that I've got to drive stuff forward and make conservation education the heart of what Hertfordshire Zoo does, which is super important for me. And yeah, alongside all of that, I've always been really passionate about photojournalism, basically. And in 2017, I was shortlisted in the new talent category for the Travel Photographer of the Year, of a sequence of images of mud wrestlers that I took in Varanasi. And I documented all their training, the traditional Kushti wrestling. Even documented myself on the last day. They asked me to strip down to my pants and wrestle one of the guys that I lost quite convincingly. But that is always one of my kind of funny travel stories, that there was a group of tourists that were walking past in Varanasi, and all they saw was me wrestling in my pants in this kind of interesting setup. But I've always been really passionate about photojournalism. But just during lockdown, when a lot of those opportunities dried up, right, like of going and traveling, and a lot to do that was documenting different cultures. Like I'd lived for a week with the Barjo tribes out in Sulawesi in Indonesia. So spent a week out there living with them, documenting what they do, and they teach their children how to free dive and spearfish at a really young age. Stayed with a family there, and just incredible like experiences, and the wildlife there, like Sulawesi crested macaques as an example, but tarsiers and knobbed hornbills. Just incredible place for wildlife, right? As well. And there was this moment actually where I was like, what really kind of showed me how wildlife can really connect is one day actually the tide went out and it left a load of rock pools, and some young children, local children, came up to me and they were like, wanted to show me something. So they basically showed me what was in their bucket, and it was a blue-ringed octopus. So I was like, "Oh wow, this is taking a bit of a plot twist." Like all of those things were really inspirational. But I put my camera down for years, from lockdown until probably about my second year at Volpro, and I just thought, actually, this is a chance. When I was at Volpro, hang on a minute, I'm seeing this stuff, and there's a chance to document the rescues. And there's this one image that I took with Clarence, one of the guys that works out at the Hartsby Port site for Volpro, and we had to go and, because I was quite hands-on as a volunteer as well. I wasn't out there just to take photos. I was, lugging carcasses around left, right, and centre, right? But there's this one photo of a juvenile Cape vulture that we had to collect from a golf course, or like the housing estate within a golf course in South Africa. And as he goes to pick it up, the wings spread out, and you just see the wingspan of this bird in comparison to a tall human. Clarence isn't short, so he's a tall human being, but just just crazy. So that led me to go, actually, well, this is something that I can do, because I think because of the style of photography that I do, and it's all about piecing together a story, being an educator really helps, because you know what you need to show people for them to understand and learn, right? So, it's the rescue part, it's the rehab part, it's the release, it's the recovery, it's the rehabilitation, it's all of that, from end to end. Can I show that? And that's how I ended up winning Bird Photographer of the Year. But since then, I've done a number of different projects. So I have worked with the Amazing Horseman Trust out in deepest, darkest Wales, and Holly and Adam out there are absolute legends, and doing some great stuff around vulture breeding, conservation out there. Absolutely fantastic ambassadors for vultures, and that's why we get on so well. And I don't just call them people that I kind of connect with every so often. They're actually really good friends as well now. So and actually, conservation can forge those really strong friendships. And then I've just got back from India, where I've been doing. I actually went out for a number of reasons. The main one was to photograph the impact of the kite festival on bird populations. So always looking for an angle on avian conservation, right? So I went out with Wildlife Vets International and worked out there with Raksha, an organisation that has a kind of rescue and rehab centre out there, and does some amazing work during the kite festival, and looking at the manager strings that impact those birds, lacerating wings and all sorts of stuff like that. So got really interesting sequence of images there. Spent some amazing time down at the Gear Forests, so documenting all the biodiversity, because it's a great birding spot down there, but obviously documenting the conservation successes that are going on down there with Asiatic lions, but also some of the challenges, as that population grows and human wildlife coexistence, all of that kind of stuff's really interesting narratives down there. And then the really interesting bit that I wasn't expecting, actually, I was meant to go and see the demoiselle crane migration in Kishan, which is a very famous spot now, where about 30,000 demoiselle cranes migrate over the Himalayas. Really, really important place. But they had a bird flu outbreak, and this is where I think sometimes Mother Nature maybe wants to direct you in a certain direction to get some content. And that meant that I ended up going with a great ornithologist called Jitu Solanki, a great guy, who took me actually out to the Jawbir Conservation Reserve outside of Bikaner in Rajasthan. It's a carcass dumping site that has a population of about 4,000 vultures, I think, migrate there at points. Egyptian, Himalayan, and Eurasian griffon, Cinereus, but I would say probably like 500 steppe eagles. There are some challenges with the stray dogs and everything that goes on there with the carcasses, but actually what uncovered itself there was a really interesting story, more about plastics. So a lot of the holy cows that get dumped on the carcass dumping site, they actually don't have a lot to eat across the cities, and consume a lot of plastic. When the vultures eat the carcasses and people take the bones away, because they can still utilise those bones in certain ways, what's left of the carcass is actually these big lumps of up to 20 kilograms of plastic. And I'm always trying to find these narratives, and actually one of the big projects I've just started working on, because I think there's something about sustainability in this as well, and I can't expect to fly across the world for these projects all the time, and then kind of profess to be all about the planet. Me and my wife have a child-free existence, so we've decided not to have children, and part of that is environmentally driven. But one thing that I'm really conscious of is actually what can I be documenting here in the UK on my doorstep? And actually, I've just started a really exciting project all around swift conservation, local community action to save swifts. So everything from men in sheds, the guys who are trying to prevent loneliness and go along and they help each other build stuff and blah, blah, blah. Super, super important part of the story. I went and I photographed a swift box being installed into a church. So I was climbing up these precarious ladders into the bell tower of this church. But also, I've got some really interesting days booked in with some Swift rehabbers who do all stuff in their like rehab 60 Swifts or House Martins in their garage, in their living room. All these local people that are making a real conscious effort to monitor, to rescue, to rehab, to educate. Crikey, there's a lot going on in the UK with Swifts right now, so that's something really exciting. And then this is a bit of an open call out for anyone listening on the podcast. If you'd like an international award-winning bird conservation photographer to come and photograph any of the work you do, you have a story, you have a narrative. My website is chriscapturesconservation.com. So, but this is the important thing, right? Actually, and I know I'm saying that there, but I don't actually. I do all of this for free, right? I do it all for free. It's for a passion, and I pay all my own costs. And actually, when it comes to Volpro, all the prize money that I won for Bird Photography of the Year went directly. Every single penny went directly back to Volpro. They have given me the access to be able to narrate that story. They're giving me now all these other opportunities, like that are coming up in future months for me. So I fundamentally have this really important role to play, and actually, yes, the financial side is important, but actually, it's more important for the safety of those vultures. So yeah, I laugh and joke, but actually, I want to work with more organisations, and I want to tell more stories and more narratives. Still do vulture stuff, that will never change, and my heart is always with Volpro. But I also want to be able to work around other avian species and all of that kind of stuff.
That's great, and we will absolutely provide a link to your new website in the show notes, and our listeners can direct themselves to there. They can also follow you on Instagram, right?
Yeah. So yeah, so it's at Chris, and then it's a double underscore Eley. So yeah. Yeah, you can definitely see I've pinned that post that I was talking about. So I actually pushed out on social media about the plastics. So I don't think I mentioned that. I think we talked offline about that post, but there's a post I just put out, really a reel that's gone viral in India about the plastic situation in the cow stomach. So that's had about 400,000 likes. It's 400,000 views and about 20 odd thousand likes. So it has really taken off. So so check that out and see what you think. And any feedback is good feedback, right?
Absolutely. At least people are watching, and yeah, feedback is ultimately what sparks improvement at the end of the day, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. It allows us to develop and move on, right? And we talked a lot about that tonight. About all of that is really important.
Yeah, it really is. So, Chris, I think you've given a wonderful insight into where you've been, where you're going. We're certainly excited to follow your journey and see what you achieve, because I'm sure there will be plenty that you are achieving. So we're just going to round up the episode with some light-hearted questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready as I'll ever be, Johnny. I mean, if my signal drops out, that's actually just me just doing some thinking time, right?
So, Chris, we've learned a lot about what makes you tick in terms of the animals that inspire you, but are there any dream species that you would love to work with or to see in the wild?
Do you know one that I really like to photograph, actually, outside of birds, is African wild dogs.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah. They've always been, saw them in Botswana many years ago, and just they're a species that I think difficult to spot, but yeah, it would be good. And in the bird world, probably southern ground hornbills. I think
Yeah.
it would be. And there's some great southern ground hornbill conservation work going on, and I'd love to be able to document some of that. So southern ground hornbills and African wild dogs, probably.
Southern ground hornbills are very striking, aren't they? It's the
Yeah.
eyelashes.
Yeah, yeah,
popping
yeah,
against that vivid red.
yeah, yeah, 100%, 100%.
And you're obviously a very well-travelled man. So, are there any places that you would love to visit, or perhaps return to? Maybe you've already visited, and there's a place that's captured you.
Okay, so I would say that the place I would like to visit would probably be, oh, good question. The Pantanal probably would
Yeah,
be. Yeah, just because I've never really done much of South America. I've done quite a bit of Central America, but never really been down there, and that's a wildlife hotbed, right? So,
yeah,
like, like there's some
absolutely.
iconic species down there. So yeah, and if I was talking about returning somewhere, oh crikey, that is a very, very good question. Um, I love Africa quite a lot, but actually it has its ups and it has its downs, but I would probably go back to India again. I think there's some definite areas to explore, and there's definitely some vulture species that still need to be ticked off in that area. So I'd like to say that I would have seen all 23 species of vulture in the wild at some point in my lifetime. Um, so yeah.
Where are you at currently?
Well, oh crikey! I reckon old world. I'm doing pretty well. And then the new world actually is a bit easier because things like black and turkey vultures actually you can see them in lots of different places, right? But I'd have to tot it up actually. I'm probably around about 12 actually. I'm very lucky when I was in the gear. I got to see Indian vultures or long-billed vultures. I got to see there, which was an added bonus. And I also, for my 40th birthday last year, headed up into the Pyrenees and saw bearded vultures for the first time in the wild, which was incredible.
It is a great point. Obviously, we've had Jose Tavares from Vulture Conservation Foundation on
Yeah,
in the past, and
yeah,
it is. I think it's still incredibly important and probably not common knowledge that we in Europe do have vulture species.
yeah. So actually, I'm going back out to Extremadura with my wife, where she runs in her spare time. So we're both people with purpose, I guess. We don't have children, and we really put that out. So she works with Spanish Podencos. We've got 4 rescue dogs. They're all Spanish Podencos, Spanish hunting dogs. So we're going to do a split trip out there where she gets to do some Podenco stuff and I get to do some birding. But yeah, down there in Extremadura, there's some great spots, but also up in the Pyrenees as well. There's some in the Spanish Pyrenees. There's some great spots. Actually, Spain has some really interesting bird species and very interesting when it comes to vultures as well.
Amazing. Well, next question: favorite sound made by an animal?
Oh, favorite sound. Right. I put a. It's not maybe sound like, but I put a. If you go onto my social media, there is a bit of vulture ASMR where it's about 12 Cape vultures over a carcass. That for me, it sounds a bit sadistic, I guess. But yeah, yeah, that would probably be it because actually that symbolises everything that I love, right? Vultures thriving because they're on a carcass and they're
Hmm.
well and they're eating, and for me, yeah, that's got to be the sound, right?
Yeah, fair play, fair play. How about animal habitat then? You've been to these places and you've seen mixed terrains. What's your
Yeah.
favourite animal habitat?
Oh, that is a good question. I would probably say, oh, I mean, look, this is going to sound really like I've probably got a better answer. So no, actually, I'm going to say this. I was going to go for the Masai Mara, but I'm actually not going to go for the Masai Mara. I'm going to go for Etosha National Park. So that those kind of the salt pans up in Namibia. Yeah, that's something else. That's a different kind of safari experience for me. And yeah, yeah, I had some really interesting travels up there. So I'd say those kind of that habitat is just very stark. Feels the end of the world, right? Like, it feels like it could go on forever.
Hmm.
Um, but really interesting place to photograph and see wildlife.
Fantastic, great answer. How about an ability of an animal that's just awe-inspiring for you? You know, there's no shortage of amazing things that animals can do that we can't really wrap our heads around.
Yeah, yeah. Um, oh, that is a good question. That is a good question. I'm gonna go vulture. I'm gonna go vultures again, right?
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
gonna I'm gonna go bearded vultures, like the ability to swallow a whole bone and then have that like pH 1 kind of like stomach acid to that. Yeah, I mean that's just insane, right? Like I'd love to be able to actually make my trips to KFC so much easier if I could do that because I wouldn't have to like try to like strip every last sinew of chicken off a hot wing, right? We could just all go down in one. Don't tell my wife that I still go to KFC.
Shout out to KFC hot wings. After a day of fighting extinction, how do you relax?
Yeah. Um, how do I relax? Oh,
Secret trips to KFC.
yeah. Do you know what? I'm actually like this doesn't sound that relaxing, but I'm really into. I like to stay on top of what's going on across the globe. I
Mhm.
love listening to politics podcasts. It just keeps me in tune in what's going on. I did politics in A level, and I still love that side of things. So definitely the rest is politics. The rest is politics USA. Both of those, especially the USA version, are quite interesting at the moment. Um, I wouldn't say it's mainly relaxing; it's quite stressful. But yeah, I love to listen to a podcast, right? And actually, yeah, politics podcasts. I sound quite boring there, don't I? But
Not
yeah,
at all,
yeah.
mate.
I'm going to end up sounding like Keir Starmer, Sir Keir Starmer by the end of it. Yeah, okay, yeah, I'll say that then. I'll say podcasts.
And we've obviously mentioned how our listeners can follow your work. So, last question: do you have any final messages for our fellow wildlife avengers out there?
Pick a species, back that species, go all in on that species, and save that species. I think that for me is the key message. Is yeah.
With that last question, Chris, thank you so much for teaming up with me on this episode of the Conservationists Assemble. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you on this topic that we're both very passionate about and hear your vision for how we can do our bit for threatened species. I certainly look forward to seeing what else you achieve both in and outside of Hertfordshire Zoo and wish you all the luck in the future.
Johnny, it's been a real pleasure. I'm sure we'll catch up in person at some point soon. But yeah, thanks for having me, and it's been a great opportunity to just chat about my job that I love and everything else around the outskirts of that. Yeah, so thanks very much, mate.
And of course, a huge shout out to you, my fellow wildlife avengers, for tuning in. Be sure to follow Chris's work on Instagram or on his website, both of which are linked in the show notes. If you enjoyed this volume of the podcast and wish to join the fight, please follow and rate the podcast wherever you stream from. Please also follow on social media to stay up to date with the podcast's latest developments and share with your family and friends to help stack the odds in conservation's favour. Don't forget you can join the fight by joining the conversation. Share your thoughts and suggestions on this episode, past episodes or future episodes via email or on social media. Be sure to tune in to next week's fantastic episode of the Conservationists Assemble. Until then, this is Johnny Bloxham signing off, over and out.